A question came up last night regarding the interpretation of Daniel 12, verse 11. Now, this can be confusing. This verse mentions two events. The first is the cessation of the offerings in the temple, the sacrificial offerings, and secondly, the setup of the abomination of desolation in the temple. But just reading this verse in isolation, we can interpret it in two ways. One way is we read it as referring to a time period between these two events. The verse talks about from the cessation of the sacrificial offerings and the setup of the abomination of desolation, there will be 1290 days. So if we interpret it to mean there's 1290 days between these two events, that would place the abomination of desolation being set up 30 days after Christ's return, after the end of the millennium. The other interpretation, alternatively, we can read Daniel 12, verse 11, is referring to the cessation of the sacrifices and the setup of the abomination is happening at the same time. So the Antichrist setting up his abomination of desolation and bringing an end to the burnt offerings, basically bringing an end to the worship of God and replacing it with worship of the Antichrist at the same point in time. So from this single point, when these two events occur simultaneously, there would be 1290 days to some other event. But as I said, if we look at this verse in isolation, it can be confusing, but I think clarity comes when we allow the rest of Scripture to help us form a more complete picture. We take the whole counsel of God in order to come up with our viewpoint. We get confused when we look at verses in isolation. We need to apply what we understand from other scriptures about when certain things happen in order to avoid confusion. So if we view these two events, the cessation of the sacrifices and the setup of the abomination of desolation, as happening at two different points in time with 1290 days in between, the question comes up is what actually is happening in those 1290 days, which is basically 3.5 years plus 30 days. Scripture mentions that many will be beheaded during the tribulation for refusing to worship the image of the Antichrist. And if we interpret this abomination of desolation as being this image, the object of worship, are we saying that the beheading occurs after Christ's return and the death of the Antichrist? What would be the purpose of the abomination of desolation being set up after the end of the tribulation when Christ has already returned and the Antichrist has been killed? If we really want to insert 1290 days between these events, between the cessation of sacrifices and the setup of the abomination of desolation, it might make more sense to say that the cessation of the sacrifices occurs at the beginning of the tribulation and then the abomination of desolation set up at the middle of the tribulation or shortly thereafter. That would seem to make more sense based on what's happening. But again, we know that the cessation of sacrifices does not happen at the beginning of the tribulation. It happens later on at the point of the middle of the tribulation, because Scripture says that it's halfway through the week or the 7 that the Antichrist brings an end to the sacrifices. If we take a look at Ezekiel 11, verses 14 to 21, God is giving a prophecy through Ezekiel referring to the regathering of Israel to the land and his blessing of them with their entry into the new covenant before they enter into the Millennial Kingdom. So these verses would be describing things that are going on during this period, so after Christ's return, before the Millennial Kingdom, when God is regathering all of Israel back to the land of Israel, after the tribulation, before the beginning of the millennium. These verses describe Israel being returned to the land and being involved in cleansing it from desolation and abomination, the defilement. And then they will be receiving the blessings of the new covenant. So these verses would suggest that the nation of Israel as a group is responsible for the removal of the abomination of desolation, a task that they would perform after they have repented and been delivered during the second advent of Christ, in preparation for the setup and their entry into the Millennial Kingdom. Now, in regards to these verses in Daniel 11 and 12, Andy Woods highlights a couple of things. And he parallels these events, this 75-day interval, and the cleansing of the temple between the end of the tribulation and the setup of the Millennial Kingdom. This period of time he parallels to the events of the Maccabean revolt and the cleansing and the rededication of the temple, the second temple in that instance, which occurred around 164 BC. At that time, Antiochus Epiphanes IV had desecrated the temple by offering a pig on the altar. The Jews revolted and eventually overcame the Seleucids, regaining control of the temple. Once they had control, the Jewish leaders set about cleansing and rededicating the temple, and the result was the institution of what is called the Feast of Hanukkah, also known as the Feast of Dedication or the Festival of Lights. In fact, this is a festival which Jesus participated in during his first advent and continues to this day. Now, whenever we discuss the feasts, I think it's useful to remember that there are 7 feasts that the Lord gave Israel, separated into 2 groups. One group of 4 spring feasts and a second group of 3 fall feasts. Now we know from Scripture that Jesus fulfilled a prophetic significance of each of the spring feasts during his first coming. So that includes first fruits, unleavened bread, Passover, and Pentecost. And we can surmise from that fact that the remaining fall feasts, the 3 fall feasts, trumpets, Day of Atonement, and tabernacles, will be fulfilled by the events related to Christ's second coming. Now, Andy Woods suggests that if we view the fulfillment of the Day of Atonement, which is the second of the fall feasts, as being fulfilled by Christ's return, there will be a period of cleansing, including the work of rededicating the temple, followed by a festival to celebrate the completion of that work. And interestingly, from the Day of Atonement, which normally occurs in September, October, until Hanukkah, which is usually in December, there is 75 days. So even though Hanukkah is not one of the original 7 feasts given by God, it would seem that there is still some prophetic significance with it nonetheless. So in this way, I think we should view this passage, Daniel 11, verse 11, as referring to two events that happen at the same point in time, and then after those two things occur, there is a period of 1290 days until some other event, in this case, the removal of the abomination of desolation out of the temple in preparation for the Millennial Kingdom.